Content warning. This story contains themes of slavery and physical violence. It is a reconstitution inspired by oral histories and memories from the period. They snatched her daughter from her arms like a crate to be loaded onto a wagon, so small that the mother's two hands could still have encompassed her whole life, and yet treated as merchandise under a sun that warmed palm and bone without distinction. The image arrives first, a little hand slipping from a lap, a woman's scream swallowed by the creak of harnesses and the measured footsteps of men who have been taught to count value by price. That moment, sudden, brute, irreversible, becomes the way Luía tells every day after. The second her world emptied, the minute the ledger replaced her name. What the narrator knows of Luía comes from the long look of someone who has watched her from the same dirt courtyard, and from the stories that other women told when the lamps were low. She is not a legend made up overnight. She is measured in the small certainties of a life that began before the sale. How she braided a child's hair with the patience of a prayer. How she smoothed a frayed bit of cloth over a knee. How she hummed tunes older than the plantation's maps. She carried Elisa as naturally as a rhythm carries a song. Naptimes, a chorus sung under the breath, while hands sifted rice, the curl of a child's sleeping breath on a mother's neck. People in the senzala, the slave quarters, used the word for her that means stubborn flower. It could be affection or an admission that where she stood was not where many dared to stand. The senzala itself smelled like ash and cassava, sweat and the iron of the river water used to wash, huts clustered under trees that offered shade but no law. Beyond them, the house grande rose with a certainty that belonged to timber, polished floors, and the slow parade of servants who wore different collars of obedience. There Sina moved, as if the world were a room she had the right to rearrange. Sina's hands were white in a way that made Luía's skin into an argument. Hands that ordered, hands that stroked a child's cheek when it was convenient, hands that signed papers at the end of a month. People spoke Sina's name softly when she was angry, as if it might make less of a weather front if the wind were not named. On the morning Elisa was taken, the light fell flat and hot, a glare across the yard that made everyone squint and made the capataz, Zé das Correntes, walk with a certain rhythm that meant business. Zé's boots made the kind of noise that wakes huts. People hushed their breathing when he passed. He carried a ledger and a rope of things, and the ledger was always heavier. Benedito arrived not as a man, but as the commerce he represented, a mercantile bridge between houses and markets, who smelled faintly of sugar and grease and coins. He spoke in the casual tones of a man accustomed to thinking of people as cargo. The deal was brief. Luía remembers the way fingers and hands moved, Sina's cool fingers that touched Elisa's cheek once, as if testing an apple for ripeness, Benedito smiling in a small, practiced way. Someone counted the baú, nothing dramatic. Then the child was turned, an arrangement made in a few lines of paper, and Luía found herself empty. Because we cannot pretend the sale was a mistake, because law and custom often lined up to make human lives negotiable, there is no melodrama in the taking, only the economy of a plantation that sees small bodies as a future workforce, as a debt repaid or contracted. The scene afterward is not filled with shouts of rebellion, so much as the quiet collapse of a horizon for one mother. Luía's wail is not the theatrical sound of a storybook. It is the flat, desperate sound of a body that has lost its axis. Other women put their hands on her back. Someone pressed a cup of warm water to her lips. Her mother, old hands scarred by years of carrying more than she could count, did not speak first. She had been through other auctions, other loss. She understood the way grief could be folded into the next day's work. The lullaby that had been Ana Elisa's small sleep song continued, crooked and raw, as if the voice could stitch the missing piece back into place. If this story speaks to you, and you want more recovered memories like this, subscribe. These are the lives we pull back from the margin, the names we keep for those who had none. After the sale, everyday life grew around the hole. The routine of labor was a crude machine that accepted any broken shape and kept turning. Luía returned to her tasks, not because she had reconciled herself to the loss, but because the work was another way to keep from unraveling. She carried two small bundles within her, grief that spoke and a grief that would not. By day she milled, carrying heavy loads with a steadiness that could be mistaken for acceptance. By night, her mind made a map of how the house moved, where keys jingled, which servants came in the afternoon to bring fresh linen, the path Sina took when she walked to the river to sit and watch the men work, as if they were a spectacle arranged for private view. Elisa existed in those maps as a small measure. The braided ribbon Luía kept hidden in the hem of her skirt, the word "little star" whispered under her breath when she scrubbed the same floorboards that had once been the child's favorite place to play. The child inhabited air as much as memory. Every time a cart passed the Senzala gate, Luía's chest tightened as if the cart could, improbably, return what it had taken. Women around her offered small comforts, borrowed fruit, a place to sleep when dreams gnawed too loud. Joaquina, who lived a hut away, had a laugh like shaking laundry and a grave resolve that made it clear she would not counsel inaction. She would lean in at night and say, "We do what we must," in the way a person states a weather fact, sober, inevitable. The mercantile logic that allowed a child to be sold also allowed other, quieter transactions. The house grande needed hands for many things, and in exchange offered things the Senzala could not usually claim: strong soap, medicine bottles, the sort of wine seen only at festivals. Those small sanctioned thefts were a kind of second currency among women, an extra piece of sugar tucked into a fold of skirt, a bit of oil for a hair. In the weeks after the sale, Luía watched and learned, not out of taste for petty crime, but because knowledge could be the difference between surviving and being broken. It is tempting to frame what happened next as a single moral decision, a stroke of defiance that made the plantation change color overnight. In truth, it was built from many small choices: a look kept, a favor paid back, a trust extended. Luía's plan, if calling it that does not make it too intentional for a grief-born thing, grew from observation. She noticed which drawers were sometimes left slightly ajar, how the housekeeper favored certain cupboards, how the lanterns were arranged at dusk. She learned the path Sina preferred on slow evenings, when the mistress liked to walk near the edge of the property to pretend it was a garden of her own making. She did not speak aloud that she would do anything. Such words have a habit of evaporating into the wrong ears. There were other allies. Benedito, though complicit in the trade, had a face that sometimes softened in private. He could not be a friend to Luía without betraying his world, but there were goods his pockets could not help but carry. He would leave a basket too heavy to be purely alms, or he would look toward the Senzala in a way that suggested some discomfort with the tally of children counted that morning. It is wrong to imagine benevolence where there was only complicity, but there are people whose consciences bend like a reed in the wind. Benedito's small acts were part of the calculus that made a plan possible, even if the man himself stayed on the verge of his own preservation. And so Luía's preparation began in the spaces where silence gathers, under the eaves at night, while others slept, in the cadence of chores that can be done with one hand. She wrapped a small bottle in cloth and set it in an inner pocket of her dress, a place she called herself. The narrator will not tell you what was in that bottle beyond calling it a corrosive solution or a liquid from the house. The tale does not need the chemistry to explain motive, and the world does not need a recipe for harm. What matters is that she kept the bottle near, like a secret prayer or an accusation folded into a palm. The network of women in the Senzala supplied more than physical shelter. They supplied counsel, stories of other mothers who had acted, warnings that sometimes came from older mouths that had seen the law used against them. Luía's own mother was a counsel of restraint and grief. "We have teeth," the old woman would say, touching her gums with a finger as if to prove the point, "but they must be chosen with care." Joaquina offered practicality, a few coins tucked into another's apron, a path cleared on moonless nights, the knowledge of who would look away at just the right moment. These were not conspirators in a spy novel. They were people who knew the limits of their lives and the weight of a child's absence. When you live where law counts for one class and not for another, the private calculus of justice becomes something closer to survival. Not everyone agreed. Some in the Senzala urged caution. There were voices that said, "Justice will come," though nobody could say when. Others feared reprisals, the possibility of whole huts burned in retaliation. The collective considered such costs the way one considers a fever. It could be fatal. The conversations were long and sometimes bitter, the words of the old woman and the young mother forming a dialectic that would not be resolved in whispers. Luía, listening, found a resolve that seemed less like courage and more like a slow acclimatization to the cold logic of a system that had already stolen her child. The plan took shape with the slowness of seasons. It was not a single movement, but a suturing of small acts. A map of the house imprinted on Luía's mind, a pocket kept for the bottle, a place in the paths where she would intercept Sina if needed. She practiced nothing. There was no rehearsed strike, but she rehearsed possibility. What to say if a guard confronted her, how to place herself where a passerby would not look. The women around her rehearsed silence, how to look without looking, how to account for absence. Preparation was not only practical, it was moral. What would be asked of them if the price of justice were another child's life? That question went unspoken sometimes because the answer hurt too much. The day that almost unraveled everything came like a child's laughter in the morning, bright and careless. It was an ordinary afternoon when a neighbor's toddler, barefoot, full of the kind of curiosity small children have when doors are new to them, found the cloth-wrapped thing Luía had hidden in the hollow of a wall. The child was not Elisa. The child had no reason to understand the terrible seriousness of objects wrapped like that. He pulled at the cloth, unfastened it with a child's patience, and there for a moment was the bottle, plain and ordinary in its glassness. From the house grande, someone noticed a movement in the courtyard, Sina's maid perhaps, or Z's shadow, and looked toward the huts. For a heartbeat the world paused. Luía, who had been mending a net and felt the sun thin across her shoulders, saw the child hold the bottle as you see someone holding a novel for the first time. The child's face was a surprise of innocence. The bottle caught the light and made a small, dangerous sparkle. She moved then, not as a striker, but as a mother moves to snatch a falling thing. There was no dramatic rush, no cinematic leap. Luía covered the child's small hands with her own, fingers pressing down with the force of a curtain closing. "No," she said, not loud but iron-soft, and the toddler froze as if a bell had rung. She unwrapped the cloth, slipping the bottle back into her dress with hands that trembled not with fear of the object, but fear of the eyes that might be watching. Someone from the house had seen the child's hands, though who exactly could not be certain. Rumor traveled faster than speech. The capataz's stiff back had turned. Sina, whom some said had a kind of look that read people as one reads numbers, had looked twice. Luía noticed the look as one notices a cloud forming at the edge of a plain day. It was not merely suspicion, it was the sense of a ledger flipping to a new page. The bottle was hidden, but the moment had lit something like a tinder in the air. That evening the conversations were turned in a different key. The old ones spoke less of the practicalities and more of the cost that had been incurred by a hand that was seen. Joaquina's face tightened in a way Luía had never seen. "Now they will watch," she said, as if stating a law discovered rather than a threat issued. Luía sat with that weight in her chest, the knowledge that a near miss had not been a near miss at all, but a kind of opening. She suspected that the sighting of the bottle by a child's hands had already been carried to other ears, a maid's idle gossip, a servant's report offered to curry favor. That night, under a sky that had the indifferent scattering of stars, Luía lay awake more than she had in weeks. Sleep refused her. The lullaby that had once been a bridge to rest now became a memory that hammered. Her mind traced back the day of the sale again and again, the way Sina's hand had brushed her child, the look of cold calculation on Benedito's face. She imagined a future in which every step she took would be counted and logged. And yet within her the pressure had not released. It had concentrated into a shape that made sense only to her. The women around her met in whispers more often. They developed small routines. Who would take a turn keeping watch? Who would visit the mistress's pantry under the pretense of work? Who could be trusted to misremember a name when questioned? Benedito, who had his own liabilities, had offered a smile that was almost an apology and an object wrapped in cloth the first time he left. "It's not mine to give," he said, "but I know what it's like to be on the wrong side of accounting." His pocket still contained coin. His face still held the look of someone who would move quickly from guilt to self-preservation. Luía, in the middle of these arrangements, found herself constantly balancing two languages, one of ordinary necessary stoicism, another that was a ledger of memory, of what had been taken. That ledger contained more than the price of a child. It contained the way a woman's body remembered nursing, the smell of infant hair, the exact place on the thigh where a tiny hand once rested. In the quiet, she recited those details as if they were proof against erasure, and yet the moral question did not leave her. It sat beside every plan like a co-worker you cannot fire. If she acted, what would the consequences be? Would another family be punished to make an example of her? Would children be taken from other mothers to rebalance some imaginary measure? The older women who had lived through worse counseled patience, but patience can also be a form of compliance, they said. The younger ones wanted action because the roar of loss had no patience for time. When Luía spoke to her mother about these things, there was a moment of silence that was not empty but dense. The old woman took Luía's hands, felt the bones and said, "You have to decide what you will carry, because you cannot carry everything." The meaning was not resigned. It was an invitation to choose burden. In the weeks that followed, the plantation's atmosphere tightened. Sina's walks became more guarded. She spoke less to the servants who had once drawn her attention. Zedas Correntes stood at odd hours with a ledger and a heavy look in his eyes, as if he were the one keeping time for a group of men who might be punished for the slightest misstep. Rumors sprang up like weeds about people who had left with clandestine help to places beyond the property. The word Quilombo moved like a wind through the huts. Quilombo, a refuge community of escaped people where fugitives took shelter, and people mouthed it both as hope and as danger. That word carried a geography of possibility Luía had once thought of only in the deepest corners of her mind. She made a secret journey at night to the edge of the property, where a stream separated the cultivated land from the rougher, wilder paths. There she met a man whose name was spoken as if not all of its syllables belonged in polite company. He had friends who navigated the marshes and the long grasses. Some of them had relatives in the Quilombo. The meeting was brief. No promises were made. They spoke in the quiet language of people negotiating risk. The man did not offer a map. He offered a point, a place to go if the house became too hot to survive. Even as she planned, Luía made gestures that kept her rooted to the life she had known. She mended another woman's sleeve. She told the story of a harvest long ago in which the rains had been merciful. These acts were not mere decoys. They were the social glue that made it possible to move without becoming a spectacle. The community's survival depended on 1,000 small courtesies and on the way people looked away for each other's sakes. In the midst of this, the mistress's own standing began to fray in small social circuits. Sina was seen as capricious by those who once flattered her. Gossip began to imagine cracks in the veneer of her possessions. In the parlors of other landowners, people spoke of the master's household in terms that suggested concern. The mistress had lost composure, they said, had become particular and less charitable. In the market, Benedito walked more softly. Such shrewd ears were not to be trusted for solace, but they were proof that public perception could be shifted by small, private events. Luía's hands began to move with a different kind of determination. She had always been practical. Now practicality took on the texture of a moral instrument. She trained herself in the non-gestures of conflict, how to place a foot where a passerby would not see it, how to let a smile pass without using teeth that might bite too hard. She rehearsed what she would say if Sina questioned her in public. She curated a face that could pass the muster of innocence. In private, she whispered a name, Elisa, like a counterspell against the decades of forgetting. But every plan must contend with chance. The day an old woman who worked in the great house fainted from fatigue, and the mistress's maid discovered a thread out of place in a sheet. The catalogue of possible suspicions grew. Sina's brow creased. She questioned servants in a way that suggested the counting of losses would not be limited to what the ledger recorded. Zedas Correntes went from hut to hut with questions that were both casual and surgical. Each of these small intrusions into the Senzala's life felt like pebbles thrown into an otherwise calm pool, ripples that changed the reflection. Luía watched all of this and felt the weight of a decision that had not yet been made pressed down on her like a harvest sun. She knew she could not put the bottle back into the placidness of being unremarked. The child's curiosity had shifted something. The mistress's eyes had read potential. Whether she moved or waited, a consequence had been set into motion. That night, she gathered a few items into a small bundle. A ribbon, a scrap of cloth that smelled faintly of lavender, a coin she had been given long ago and had kept in the hem of her dress for luck. She tucked the scrap of Elisa's hair. Only she and her mother knew where she had hidden it, against her heart, and tried to imagine the future of a life made from the pieces of memory. The plan was no longer only about reclaiming a daughter. It had become caught up in the shape of what justice might look like when the law refused to recognize the personhood of some. Then came the sound, the clatter of hurried steps from the house grande, a noise like the wind when a door slams in a storm. Someone shouted a name, a maid's cry or Z's bark, and the hut where Luía had left her bundle felt suddenly smaller. Women's voices rose and fell, but not in the old rhythms. It was panic that trembled at the edges. Luía stood and felt the floor under her feet as if for the first time. The bottle she had hidden, the plan she had kept, the child she could not forget, all felt colliding toward a point she could not yet see. She moved toward the doorway, where the moon painted a bar of silver across the ground, and in that strip of light she could see the shadow of a man running, a figure unfamiliar, and the shape of a cart turning at the gate. Someone beyond the line of darkness called out, and the name that answered was not a name Luía recognized. The air tasted of iron and rain that had not yet fallen. Her heart beat the way it had the day a small hand left her lap, with the sense that the world had become a transaction, and she was bargaining for the last thing she would hold dear. In the house somewhere, a door shut with the biased finality of a verdict. In the hut's hands moved faster than words. Luía could not tell whether the ravine between her and the house would widen into a gulf, or whether a bridge could yet be built from the pieces she had gathered. She felt the pull of something fundamental, whether she would let the ledger write the end of her story, or whether she would make a tally of her own. At the threshold of dawn, aware now that the moment had shifted from the private to the public, Luía wrapped the cloth around the bottle tighter and pressed it under her shirt. Her mother took her by the wrist, silent but steady, and when their eyes met, there was a conversation that needed no words. There was recognition on both faces, that the world will measure out by one standard, and the small resistances must always reckon with their cost. As the first light came, the plantation moved like a beast waking. Voices rose across the yard. A bell clanged in a sequence that meant someone had been accused, perhaps. The air hummed with the knowledge that what had almost been exposed, a child's fingers on a bottle, was now a point of light that might draw more attention. Luía felt the press of time like a hand at the nape of her neck, urging decision. She stepped away from the hut, her feet finding the familiar path that led toward the stream and the wild grasses beyond. Her steps were not the stride of a woman who had made up her mind in a clean, moral instant. They were the steps of someone who had been rearranged by loss and who carried that rearrangement like a new bone in her body. She moved toward the boundary where the cultivated and the wild met, and with each step she thought of the child who had once slipped from her arms and the woman whose hands had touched that child's cheek, as if testing the fruit. At the stream a messenger waited, a slim figure cloaked in the plain clothes of those who had no name to sell, and when Luía came close, he handed her a scrap of cloth tied with a strip of leather. On it was a small symbol, a mark the Quilombo people used as a discreet greeting. No words. The gesture itself was the promise that there was an outside where one's worth was not counted in a ledger. Behind her the plantation thrummed. Voices carried across the distance like insects. She felt the hush of all the women's lives, the ones who had bent low in kitchens, the ones who had wept in the dark, and she felt, too, the heavy moral geometry of what she entertained in her hands. She tucked the scrap into her pocket and turned toward the path that led back. The world had rearranged itself around an axis that could not be undone. What would be done next would not only mark one woman, but change the way names were remembered in the huts and perhaps in time in other houses and markets. It would be a mark less of satisfaction than of necessity, because they had taken what was hers and left her nothing but the shape of a choice. Luía walked back to the senzala with the quilted light of morning, making patterns at her feet. There was a sense of something closing, The moment of concealment had passed into a moment where action would be visible. She breathed and felt the air as if it were a thing to be judged for its fidelity. Her hands were steady now in a way they had not been before. She did not yet know the shape of the consequences. She did not yet know if the house's suspicion would bite like a hound or slink away with interest. She only knew the truth that had lodged in her chest since the day a cart had taken her child. No law would call her grief legitimate. No ledger would account for a mother's sleepless nights. If justice was a mirror that refused to reflect her, she would find another looking-glass. If the law would not hold the thief, she would hold an accusation of her own. And even as that thought formed in the small private theatre of her mind, the narrator knows the moral danger of turning suffering into a script for retribution. Luía's plan is not a clean answer to institutional cruelty. It is an act pressed into the narrow margins life leaves after it has been counted. Her resolve is both a claim of agency and a crossing into something that cannot be easily justified. The women around her understand this ambiguity as well as she does. It lives in the way their eyes meet and do not judge. Beyond the line of huts, Sina walked along the veranda, a figure of polished certainty. She paused and looked toward the senzala, as if sensing a shift in the air. For a moment their gazes met across the distance, two women poised at different ends of a history neither had written alone. Sinat adjusted a sleeve and blew out a slow breath, unsure whether the life of an heiress of place could take a turn under the weight of a mother's agony. She thought of reputation and the ledger of appearances. She thought of a child's face she had touched. The thought did not soften her in any easy way. It complicated her ownership with an unnerving personal ache. Within Luía, the ache had already become a kind of fuel. She returned to the hut where the bottle lay warm against her skin and placed her hand over it for a moment, feeling nothing but the pulse of decision. That pulse would have to hold for what came next, the moment when she would choose to mark not just her own loss, but the mistress who had touched her child, as if testing an apple. The mark Luía planned to make was not only personal revenge, it was a stubborn claim that a life counted by the law could be counted otherwise. At noon, as the sun climbed and the plantation hummed in mechanical chore, a child laughed somewhere beyond the fence, an ordinary human sound that made Luía's throat tighten. She closed her eyes briefly and mouthed her daughter's name. That small ritual held her like a prayer. Around her, the huts breathed the long, patient rhythm of people trying to survive. There was work to be done, but the work now carried the possibility of something else, a fracture in a system that treated human flesh as goods and a seed of resistance planted in the soil of personal grief. The day stretched ahead, and with it the delicate architecture of plan and risk. The near exposure of the bottle had sharpened all the outlines. Who could be trusted? What steps must be hidden? Which allies might fend off discovery or invite it? In the mid-afternoon, as the sun poured from a high place and the wind lay docile, Luía stepped outside to fetch water and felt the eyes of the house upon her like a measurement. She walked as one might walk through a trial, each footfall conscious of the weight it bore. When she returned to the hut, she found Joaquina waiting with a look she could not quite read. The neighbor's hands trembled. For a moment the two women stood there in the shaded doorway, a small architecture of solidarity, and the world seemed to hold a breath. Joaquina handed her a scrap of cloth with a knot in it and said nothing for a beat. Then in a voice the color of a night that knows what storms can do, she said, "They are talking. A man from the house asked about you." The sentence was spare, not an accusation, not a panic, merely a fact. Luía's fingers tightened on the cloth. The knot in it felt suddenly like a scab over an old wound, something pressed and needed tending. What the narrator leaves at this point is not a conclusion, but the moment just before history forces a decision. The near miss of the child and the bottle has ripened into suspicion. The plantation's gaze has reoriented. Luía feels the pressure as one feels an approaching storm, wind that will either pass or break something. She looks at Joaquina, then at the pathway that leads beyond the fields. The possibility of flight whispers like a promise. The possibility of staying and acting in place is a different kind of promise, louder and more dangerous. She tucks the bottle into the inner fold of her dress again and feels its outline, a small, cold certainty against her ribs. There are duties that tie her to the huts, to the children who still sleep, to the old woman who is her mother. There is, too, the iron sense that the law will not correct what has been done. The world has given her few instruments. She will have to choose from what remains. A rooster crows in the yard. A cart wheels past the gate. A bell in the house rings. Luía lifts her head and breathes as if the motion itself might steady a tiny raft on which she must soon sail. The narrator watches her stand at the edge of an action that will not be neat and will not be wholly moral in the ways law and scripture might demand. The choice she's about to make will ripple outward, staining reputations and altering lives beyond the one she seeks to fix. When she steps out into the open again, the plantation seems to hold its breath, as if recognizing that a story is about to be told in human bodies and not in ledgers. Luía moves with the steadiness of someone who understands the cost, but refuses to let the ledger tell her final line. Luía moves with the steadiness of someone who understands the cost, but refuses to let the ledger tell her final line. She chose an afternoon when the house felt hollowed by routine. Sina had spent the morning receiving calls from a neighbor, had taken to inspecting silver with a kind of greedy tenderness, and Zedas Correntes had left for the fields with half the men, convinced the hour was safe for heavy labor. The sky was the dull, honest blue of late dry season. Heat made the veranda boards soften underfoot. Luía had watched Sina's habits for weeks and found that the mistress favored a particular stretch of dirt path that ran between the river willow and the old mule shed, an exposed place known, visible yet oddly private in that people passed by without looking if their business was elsewhere. Luía waited at the edge of a small orange tree, hands folded around the scrap of cloth that contained Elisa's hair and the coin she had kept. Her mother's fingers had smoothed her braid into place that morning and pressed a kiss to the hollow beneath her collarbone without speaking. Between them was an economy of words, counsel that could not be given in the open, and permission that the old woman gave without disclaimers. When Sina appeared, arriving from the garden with a fan tucked into her sleeve, she moved with the habitual grace of someone who believed her possessions ordered the world. A maid trotted behind with a bowl of chilled water. A small spaniel trotted ahead. Sina's face, as always, was a study in discipline and impatience, touched with the strange, softened look that sometimes settled on the owners of impossible lives when they let themselves imagine another feeling, remorse, curiosity, vanity. One could not be sure. Luía rose and stepped into the path. Her feet did not rush. They held the pace of someone who did not want to be mistaken for a threat on the wrong side of the ledger. Sina saw her, and for a moment blinked, as if a fly had flown through a window. She did not move to speak. There was a quality of surprise in the mistress's glance that could later be read as recognition. Recognition, perhaps, that a life she had touched had eyes that watched her now. "You took my daughter," Luía said. The words were small in the space between them, but carried as clearly as command. There was no pleading in her voice. There was only the refusal to let the taking be unaccounted for. Sina's first reaction was to look offended, as if the very notion that a servant might speak plain words in a place meant for polished euphemisms was insolent. "You presume—" she began. Then her breath caught. For an instant she touched one sleeve with the other hand, as if to remember which glove to wear. Luía's fingers tightened on the cloth in her dress until the fabric creased. She reached slowly like someone drawing a photograph from beneath a book. The bottle she had carried close for months now sat in her palm, hidden by the fold of her skirt. She did not raise her voice. She did not speak another line. There are things that are not argued. They are set down like proofs. Sina laughed once, not a laugh that had warmth, but the brittle sound of a bell struck to call attention. "What do you imagine yourself doing, woman?" she said. Her words were meant to shepherd the moment back to what Sina understood. Class, distance, the neatness of the ledger. Luía stepped forward. She did not shout. She did not aim to kill. What she did was something quieter and less easy to translate into either justice or crime. She let the world register another fact. With a movement that refused to be theatrical, she tipped the bottle. The liquid that came out did not explode or sear the earth in a spectacle. It spread in a small, focused arc that found Sina's sleeve and then the fold of her cheek, leaving a dark, stubborn stain on fine cloth and skin. The color clung as if it had a mind of its own. It would not simply lift with soap or with apologies. It altered how light returned from a face and how the seam of a sleeve read in the midday sun. There was a shriek from somewhere. A maid, a child, Z's voice somewhere off in the field, and suddenly the world split into sound and motion. Sina slapped at her cheek and cried out, more from embarrassment than pain. Her maid dropped the bowl of water. It shattered into a scatter of sound. Men came running, and with them the sharp professional movements of people trained to correct disorder. Luía heard them approach like waves. She heard Benedito swear under his breath as he crossed from the market stall where he had been speaking to an acquaintance. She heard Joaquina's footfalls and the heavy step of her own mother. She felt hands seize her arms, some rough, some gentle, but hands nonetheless. For a moment, she had the satisfaction of seeing Sina unmade in the eyes of those who mattered to reputation. The stain on a mistress's face cut a line through decorum quicker than any whispered scandal. People looked at Sina with the sudden curiosity they afford marred objects. In that glance was the seed of a new accounting. "How you will be punished," Zé said, his voice a blade of protocol. "For this—" His eyes swept the scene, and for a second they lingered on Sina, on the darkening line across her cheek, and then flicked back to the huts as if to count who had been a spectator. Luía did not fight when they took her. She let them bind her wrists with a strip of cloth rather than the rope that would be more show. Her throat was dry. When Sina sobbed and demanded indignation, when she struck Luía in a gesture that was meant to define retribution, Luía took the blow as if it were another measurement placed upon her body. She answered with a single line, spoken once into the din, "You took my daughter." Then the push and the pulling began. The plantation's quick administrative cruelty. Z barked orders. A pair of men hefted her toward the little cart that served as transport for those accused of theft or disruption. Benedito lingered at the edge, his face the look of someone who had reached for a safety not there to be had. Joaquina's hand brushed Luía's arm. In that gesture there was a small, private instruction. Remember the path, remember the markers, hold the coin close. The man from the stream who had been watching with his collaborators moved like a shadow. He was not an official. His presence was the kind that might tilt a consequence. What happened next was not tidy. Luía was shoved into the cart and driven toward the plantation house, first to answer for the act, then to be exhibited as a lesson. Men and women gathered along the route, the hush of the huts broken by whispers and the occasional mutter. Some looked with pity, others with a hunger for spectacle. Children were told to stay inside. The master's household emerged in clusters, the mistress's friends forming an orbit around Sina, as if to protect the delicate commodity of her status. Inside the house, Sina's world collapsed into something feverish and small. She demanded names, slung accusations to shift attention, and insisted on writing to people of influence, neighbors, a lawyer she half remembered from parties. The stain on her cheek made the moves clumsy. Every touch to the mirror, every scraped attempt at cleaning turned her anger into a spectacle. In the parlors, men of property spoke in coded tones about the danger of servants with motives, about the risk of contagion when loss finds a strategy. A few voices, softer, dared to suggest that perhaps the selling of children, rare, regrettable, had its own consequences, but these were muffled quickly. Outside in the huts the reaction was layered. Some celebrated in silence, as if a small private triumphant had been won. Others were frightened. The plantation's machinery reacted like a well-oiled instrument. Orders for more patrols, for the locking of certain doors at night, for the listing of people who had been seen near Sina in the days prior. There were rumors of floggings, punitive measures designed to show the cost of upsetting the prescribed order, but in the telling, those rumors were shorthand for fear rather than precise detail. The narrator will not dwell on the infliction. Only the fact that punitive consequences followed is presented as part of the ledger that counts human beings in files and numbers. Yet while punishment was arranged, something else, less measurable, more stubborn, began to spread. The stain on Sina's cheek, in the parlors and at market, became a story. People who would never enter the plantation gates heard of the mistress who had been marked. In taverns and on market days, the tale migrated and altered. Some said Luía had struck Sina, others said she had splashed a liquid, some claimed the mistress had been disfigured. Each retelling shaped what the mark meant. For a few it was humiliation, for others it was a visible accountability that gentility could not easily buy away. Luía's cart did not take her to the stocks, as some expected. It took a crooked route to a small room behind the stables where decisions waited. There was a brief trial of sorts, conducted by men who moved between law and custom with a comfort born of practice. They spoke of fines, they spoke of restorative actions, release for a price perhaps, or exile to a distant plantation. The logic was mercantile even in chastisement. Sina demanded the harshest outcome. "Let her be a warning," she said. "Teach them what happens." But the man from the stream had not been idle. A small group had already moved, soft-footed through the tall grass, taking advantage of the confusion. Joaquina, who had a way of keeping 3 thoughts in the shape of a single hand, appeared suddenly and said she had a cousin who had a cart headed towards the river road. Benedito, in the moments when he was least calculating for his own survival, had slipped a coin to a guard and asked for leniency. In the shuffle of self-preservation and allegiance, small mercies appeared. By the time the men decided on the public narrative, explainable mischief, and a token payment to settle the mistress's outrage, Luía had been slid from one set of hands to another. She was given an opportunity some prisoners are offered: remove yourself from the plantation and never return. The offer was an admission of how brittle a system of property can be when a single mark fractures public confidence. They would not search for her in the hills. They would prefer the problem to be solved quietly. Luía accepted what was given. She did not go because the law had rightly judged her. She went because the safest path for the people she loved was not to linger where revenge could spill over into communal violence. The man from the stream had a small boat, and by dusk, with a cloth wrapped across her shoulder and Joaquina's solid presence near, she slipped into the reeds and was pulled silently along the dark ribbon of water that separated the cultivated from the wild. The Colombo welcomed her in the manner of those who have seen many arrive with stories lent by the wind and grief knotted into their clothes. There is no single Colombo in the telling. There are many small communities, improvised and steady, places where fugitives carved a life close to marshes and hills. This one offered shelter behind a stand of palms, a small cluster of houses and smoke and songs that stitched together the day. People looked at her hands and at her face, at the way she did not yet know how to sit still, and made the sorts of small offerings that are the currency of refuge: a bowl of cassava, a place by the hearth, a night watch. She learned quickly that refuge held its own complications. In public, the Quilombo's elders welcomed her with a ceremony that was not of celebration, but of recognition. They heard the story the way people hear a weather report, something to be recorded and heeded. "We do not trade one injustice for another," an elder said, an admonition and a reminder that resistance and cruelty can live in the same chest. Some of the younger folks, who had themselves known the sting of sale and the ache of lost kin, looked at Luía with admiration that made her uneasy. Others, whose families had fled in hope rather than in confrontation, asked practical questions. Would the plantation come looking? Would the pressure on neighbors intensify? They spoke of balance and of secrets kept for the sake of many. In private, the community offered conversations that were painful and honest. "You marked her," someone said, not as praise but as a statement. What did that mean? Did you mean to wound or to remember? The question made Luía feel like an object being measured. She could not say whether she felt vindication. She said what she could, that the action had been an insistence that the world not forget, a refusal to let an injustice be smoothed into everyday commerce. Rumors from the plantation followed her like a trailing flag. Sina's social life suffered in the weeks after. Neighbors invited her less. The stain on her face became a badge of gossip, of the fragility of status before visible consequence. Benedito found his own trade affected as men weighed his complicity against his occasional kindness. Some clients stepped away. Sassy's ledger thickened with notes and warnings, but could do little to alter the reality that a mark had shifted public sentiment in unexpected ways. In the town market, a coin changed hands differently. The look of people who traded gossip carried something new, an awareness that property was not a thing of absolute authority. The plantation's reaction was not uniform. Some men favored greater brutality to erase any trace of insubordination. Others privately, increased measures to hide the blemishes of economic life. But the narrative had changed. Conversations that had once softened the sale of children into a matter of bookkeeping were interrupted by an image that could not be quantified. A mistress with a mark that would not wash away. Months passed. Luía lived under the roof of the Quilombo in a house that smelled of wood smoke and drying pepper. She learned the rhythms of the place, how the milk was shared, how names were given to children born between droughts, how the elders kept memory in the pattern of their stories. She saw how solidarity could be ordinary, a hand on an injured sheep, a hammock lent for sleep, a pact to watch the fields when a new family arrived. She came to understand that refuge does not erase grief, it houses it differently. Her life there was not one of triumph. She feared news. Every messenger arriving with a report of a legal seizure or an arrest made her hands go cold. She feared that the plantation might redeem its honor with cruelty aimed at those who had been kind to her before. And there was a more private ache, the absence of Elisa. No one in the Quilombo could tell her where the child had been taken, northward to another estate, perhaps sold through a port, perhaps dying of a fever in a strange place. The uncertainty was a constant companion that slept with her and woke with her. At night she would take out the ribbon from the hem of her dress and smell it as if scent could trace a path across distance. Time, however, has a way of making stories settle into memory. The tale of Luía's marking of Sinar travelled and took forms. Some told it as a parable of righteous recourse. Others told it as the sorrowful record of a woman who could not be placated. Young women in the Quilombo sang a short, sharpened lullaby that mentioned Elisa's name in the same breath as a warning, that a life counted only by price calls out for different accounts. At market days, an old man would shake his head and say, "A woman marked a mistress," and people would nod, as if the line between outrage and necessity had been drawn and was now a caution to children. Luía did not become a legend. She did not lead raids or pose as an avenger carved from the heat of revenge. She mended nets. She shared cassava. She built a small garden where she grew beans, and sometimes a flower that reminded her of the word the Senzala women used, the stubborn flower. In the evenings she would sit by the fire and tell stories to children who had never known the plantation. She spoke of a life that had been ordinary and then shifted. She shared the small rituals she had kept, like the way to braid in a child's hair so that sleep would come more quickly. Her storytelling was not didactic. It was a preservation, an act of memory meant to make sure that when someone said the word sail, there would be a face attached to it. There were costs. Sometimes neighbors, those who had not been at the Quilombo for years, told of increased patrols at the shore or of men from the plantation pressuring landowners to assist in searches. A few families with ties to the huts found their children singled out for extra work. Luía carried these reports with sorrow rather than pride. She had not imagined that one action, even when born of a darkness that felt as if it would split you open, would ripple into other hands. Years later, when seasons had layered over one another like new pages in a book, Luía was a woman whose hair had silvered at the temples and whose hands held the map of a life in gentle creases. She often sat on a log near the stream and watched children follow the water's edge. She would trace her fingers along the old ribbon and recall the exact grain of the dirt path where Sinar had walked and the shade of her dress. People in the Quilombo treated her with a respectful mixture of caution and affection. When elites in town mentioned the incident, they did with the soft disdain of people who smooth creased cloth. Some described the mistress as marked, a word that carried with it both pity and a sense of social injury. Others spoke of the marked mistress as a sign that the veneer of gentility could be pierced. Luía never saw Sinar again. Rumors claimed that Sinar had left the plantation for Europe for a season. Others said she had remarried. None of these reports carried proof. The truth that mattered to most was not whether the mistress's body carried a permanent sign, but that in the years that followed, people were more careful with the way the ledger counted children. Auctions became whispered and more carefully justified in public. Buyers found themselves admonished when they boasted about expanding their stock. A small domestic discomfort had become a fissure in a larger acceptance. Within the Quilombo, people debated what Luía had done. Some elders said that the mark she forced on Sinar had been an act of deterrence. a way to make visible the invisible accounting of a system that sold flesh. Others asked whether private revenge could ever be a stable basis for justice. "We must imagine laws that count everyone," one elder said, "so that we do not keep inviting the same dark answer." They spoke about memory, what stories to tell to children, how to frame the act so that it would not be an instruction in harm, but a warning about the cost of living where law is indifferent. Luía listened and contributed with the careful humility of someone who had acted out of unbearable grief and who had learned that acts settle unevenly in the world. Elisa's name never left her mouth. It lived in a necklace of fragments, memories, the ribbon, the color of a dress. Sometimes a woman from a neighboring village, whose father had once been a driver for Benedito, would pass through with a rumor. The shape of a child's laugh in a distant estate, the sighting of a girl who matched the description of Elisa. Sometimes Luía would follow after such rumors, like someone following a drift of smoke, never finding more than breath. The absence was a kind of horizon that never quite drew nearer. What comforts one may offer is not the eradication of pain, but the habit of care. Luía found ways to care that did not depend on public recognition. She taught girls to braid hair the way her mother had taught her. She argued quietly for a communal oath among neighbors in the Quilombo to protect vulnerable children from sale and from traders who might promise false work in distant towns. Through small acts, an encoded message left in a bundle of cassava peel, a warning hummed in a laundry song, she and others fashioned a safety that had the awkward human quality of improvisation. The moral questions did not vanish. Children asked pointed things as they grew. Was it right? Was my mother brave? Luía taught them the fullness of a life, that sometimes grief pushes people into choices that are both human and hazardous, that to name an injustice does not always justify the means of protest, that memory carries both the weight of accusation and the responsibility of restraint. She did not offer tidy answers. She shared the ledger she kept privately, a list of small reconciliations attempted, a record of nights she could not sleep, and the single line, Elisa, that she repeated to keep the past real. Years later, there came a morning when the wind carried word of Sinar's faint social fall. A neighbors noticed that the mistress would not receive visitors at a certain ball. People in the Quilombo muttered and then returned to the steadier work of days. For Luía, the news was less vindication and more a small, cold reminder. Reputations shake, and sometimes the world finds ways to rebalance itself. But balances are not corrections, they are shifts. Each shift leaves some people further crushed. The mark Luía had made, whether a stain on skin or a scar upon reputation, did not erase the sale of children. Families still feared lenders and buyers. Laws remained blind in many places. Yet something subtle had changed in how the community taught its children to count their kin. More care, more whispering, more clandestine movement of those at risk to places where ledgers did not reach. For those who lived through it, the story was both a caution and a memory, a record of what grief can compel and of how the world responds. In the end, Luía's life became a story that could not be rounded into a neat moral. She was not a saint, nor merely a criminal. She was a woman who had been emptied and who, in the way grief will, found a need to make the taking visible. The Quilombo kept her. The children kept her stories. The plantation kept a record that was part embarrassment, part ledger. And the mistress, Sina, kept a memory of a face she could not wash clean and a reputation that had been altered not only in her own sight, but in the sight of the town. On dusk, when the sky painted the water with the color of old coins, Luía would sit on the bank and trace the reflection of the trees. She would whisper Elisa's name and then ask the question that seemed to hold the history together. Who counts? Who gets counted? She knew the answer was not simple. The law counted in one way, the heart counted in another. Between those counts, people make their lives and their choices, and sometimes those choices mark other people, forever altering how names are remembered. There is no neat ending to such a tale. Some would ask for punishment, others for absolution. The job of memory is not to deliver verdicts, but to hold stories so that future hands might think differently. The stain on Sinar's sleeve, the rumor at the market, the songs in the quilombo. These are the ways a community keeps a ledger that the law refused to write. They snatched her daughter from her arms like a crate. Luía answered in the only way left to her voice and body, and in doing so marked the mistress, physically, socially, irreversibly. The mark did not heal the hole in Luía's life, nor did it undo the system that had allowed the sale. It became instead a part of the memory people use to teach children what it costs when a world reduces persons to price. If this story leaves you with a single word in your mind, write it below. Is it vengeance or excess? Share this memory so that the names taken and the marks left will not be forgotten.